In this week's pod, we were joined by Eoin Condren to discuss building with conscience, cement's eco dilemma. Eoin is a corporate development director at Ecocem, in charge of the strategic structuring of the business to allow it to take advantage of the many opportunities that it currently has in front of it. He's been with the company 2.5 years. His background is in finance, and he spent 15 years working in real estate, infrastructure, and tech private equity, investing in the US, the UK, and throughout Europe.
He's a keen rugby fan and very average player whose lowest moment has to be the time Dale, a prop, outsprinted him. A fullback come winger on an attacking move around 10 years ago. Jeez, who wrote this? Wow. That was a really interesting podcast. I didn't think, we spent 1 hour 20 talking about concrete. Nothing,
Yeah.
And who'd have thought that it could actually be such an exciting topic? And there's just so much innovation going on in the industry. Like, what were your thoughts, Dale?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First, to clarify, I did not write that bit. I genuinely did outsprint Eoin when he was at the end of his career. But yeah, it was good times playing rugby with Eoin. He's Irish. He's full of passion. Loves his rugby, but clearly Martin also loves and has a lot of enthusiasm for cement, concrete, and clinker. So listen out for what the difference is between those three folks. But as you say, we always, I always felt it was, Eoin had the ability to make concrete sexy, but not as sexy as he did on this podcast. Were there certain things that stood out particularly for you, Martin, that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I really enjoyed his explanation of just the definitions, because I certainly have used concrete and cement interchangeably, and I'll be honest, I'd never even heard of clinker until today. I really liked his explanation of some of the innovations going on in the industry. He talked about timber, and that's seen as a bit of a wonder product at the moment, and some of the roles of governments in driving change and innovation in the industry. How about you, Dale?
Yeah, I think for me, the perspective globally that he brought on how concrete is, I guess, manufactured, how cement is manufactured throughout the globe is different depending on raw materials, what's available, the demand of concrete required for the speed of construction. So I think this one is really, really relevant to a lot of our listenership across the globe. So
he's very stats driven as well. I think Val would have enjoyed this one.
He did, yeah. We don't want to mention Val. He cried off sick for this one. But anyway, we'll let him listen to this. We'll let everyone else listen to this as well, Martin. Let's leave it there, I think. So, folks, as we say, keep listening, keep liking, and keep paying it forward.
We understand construction. I think how we can help is identifying that risk up front and enabling the transparency that our tools bring to the table.
Hello, project people, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the Project Chatter podcast. You've guessed it, no Val on this one. He's cried foul. I think he's probably drowning his sorrows, Martin, with Australia jumping out of the World Cup at the pool stage. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it must be a curse of Eddie Jones strikes again. But yeah, a bit more exciting for you guys, Ireland and South Africa.
It absolutely is, and very apt for our guest on the show, Mr. Eoin Condren. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very good. Even better after the weekend in Paris.
Lovely, lovely. Well, there's a few more games yet to go. South Africa, Australia are out, South Africa are in, Ireland's in. Martin, for you, England's in. I don't know how, but they're in. But let's not talk World Cup too much. We'll save it maybe for the end. How do we make cement sexy? We'll try, I think, with the topic of this episode. But before we get there, Eoin, I don't know if you mind sharing a bit of your origin story and sort of your backdrop and what's brought you to present day dealing with cement.
Yeah, it's been a fairly roundabout course to get here, I suppose. My claim to fame is that I did actually do my thesis at undergrad on cement, which is absolutely pathetic in many ways. but it actually got published. It got published. I had 2 papers published. So there you go. Like at the very beginning, I had sort of a long, I had a love affair with cement for some strange reason, but hopped back out of it as quickly as possible after uni, where I studied engineering in Trinity College in Dublin, and quickly left Ireland to get into the bright lights of London and into the world of finance. So I went into largely for the majority of my career, I've been in private equity to a large extent, investing into various real estate or various asset classes, including real estate, infrastructure, a few tech investments along the way. Spent some time out in the States in business school, came back out here to London, and again was investing across the UK, Europe, and the USA. So I sort of jumped into Ecocem probably 2.5 years ago now, having known them for quite a while actually. They're an Irish company, been around for 20 years, and one thing led to another after various conversations. And they had really great breakthrough opportunities that I found too hard to resist trying to help out with, and hopped on there a couple of years ago to help them basically try to take advantage of these big opportunities in various ways. And it being an entrepreneurial company, there's been lots of learning curves for me along the way, having come sort of from more of a finance background. But I was lucky enough in my earlier career to spend a lot of time with operators, and actually was in a tech company called VTS as well for a short time. So I had a nice sort of what's the word? A leap over from finance to operations, back to finance, and back into operations again. So all good so far.
Nice, lovely. Well, you certainly aren't the average project professional we have on this podcast, which is great because you're going to bring us a different perspective here. But guaranteed, I reckon 99% of our listeners work on projects that deal with concrete or cement
Most probably.
or clinker. But let's get into those. We love baselines. So myself, Martin, Val, we all have a project controls background, right? And what controls folk love to do on projects is set baselines, right? We love them. We like baseline, we're there. That's like we geek out on baselines. The more detail, the better. What is cement? What is concrete? What is clinker? And what's the difference between the three?
Okay, if you want me to go detailed, I'm probably going to end up speaking for the next hour non-stop. But I'll try and take it in tidbits so we can sort of keep the conversation going. But I guess the first place to start is that concrete is the sort of structural stuff that we see all around us. And I think the most important, or one of the most important things to start with, is just to recognize how amazing a product it is, frankly, and how it has shaped society for a long time till now, and will continue to shape society for a long time to come. And it's every so often it starts getting a bit of a bad rep, and the bad rep around now is as a result of cement, which is in concrete, which I'll get back to in a second, but the CO2 associated with that. But ultimately, it is a truly remarkable product. I mean, you've got this thing which is abundantly available around the world, is incredibly cheap, so that pretty much anybody can purchase it, incredibly easy to use, so anybody can use it, can effectively flow like water and take any shape for about 2 hours, and then after 2 hours harden and stay that way for hundreds if not thousands of years. Like, it is incredible, and it's used as I said, extensively throughout the world, and it's sort of built the environments in which we live. So there's a huge amount of it consumed, and there'll be continuing to be a huge amount consumed. I think one of his books, Bill Gates said, and I like using this quote because it sort of shows the scale, but he said that there's going to be a new New York City built every month for the next 40 years. I mean, there's just a huge amount
Holy
of building
shit.
that continues to be done across the world. And we sort of live in our developed world bubble where, there's quite a lot of construction always going around. You just need to open your eyes. But when it comes to the world that is developing around us into sort of certainly Asia, Southeast Asia, certain parts of Africa, there's just a phenomenal amount of this stuff being consumed in any given year. And there's one other phrase that I tend to try, that I read in The Guardian a couple of years ago and always stuck with me because it sort of shows the scale. Because you can throw out words like there's 30 billion cubic meters of concrete consumed every year, but no one can get their head around 30 billion, right? So there was a phrase I read in The Guardian a few years ago. It stuck with me, and it was by the time you finished reading this sentence, 19,000 bathtubs of concrete will have been poured.
19,000.
That's a huge amount of bathtubs of concrete being poured in, what was that, 15 seconds or 10 seconds or maybe 20 seconds because I mumbled my words. But yeah, there's a huge amount of concrete being consumed at any given time. So first of all, that's concrete. It's an amazing product. It's mind-blowing how much of it is consumed in any given year. Now, what's the difference between concrete and cement? Well, concrete, as I said, is the hard structural stuff that you see all around you. It's what buildings are made of. It's what's in your foundations, roads, tunnels, etc. Cement is effectively the binder or the powder, the grey powder that you see people pouring out of bags historically. And cement is the glue that essentially sticks the stones, the sand together after it mixes with water. And so the key issue, I guess, and first of all, it's important to recognize the difference between concrete and cement because everyone sort of puts the two of them together. But it is important to recognize there is a very, very big difference there. An important thing to recognize now, if we sort of move on to the CO2 aspect of things, I can sort of get that into a bit more detail, but I think it's just important to make the distinction between cement and concrete. And then you mentioned the word clinker, Dale, and you know, I probably don't get into this too early, but within cement, you've got this key constituent, which is called clinker. It's the key reactive constituent within cement, or certainly conventional cement that we use. So I'll get into that in the CO2 context in a second, but you start with concrete, you move down a level into cement, and you move down a level again into clinker. And the reason you have to go all the way down to clinker is because when you start talking about CO2, that's the sort of level that you need to go to because it all stems from clinker, really.
Right. That is such a good baseline. And you know what? You have such a passion for this. I mean, normally you and I are talking rugby mainly, and I feel like I could listen to you go on, and which I am going to, and ask you so many questions around this. But clearly the passion is there. Clearly that thesis you did, is being used now. I think it's also fascinating for those listening in to understand the difference, because I think you're right. A lot of the times we talk in construction and we talk about CO2 in construction, but we don't actually know where it is. And so I think that's you setting the baseline for us to understand where the CO2 issues are, or actually decomposing it first before we get to where the CO2 issues are. I think it's really, really important for those listening to understand the different constituent parts. So you were going on then, you're saying clinker is where the issue is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just to your point about understanding the constituent parts, it's really important because, you know, there's a phrase I've heard before, which is concrete is ubiquitous to the point of anonymity. You know, it's so everywhere. It's so around you. It's sort of, it's you don't even see it. Like there's so much of it everywhere. And people just say concrete, cement, certainly those two things, just interchangeably. And it's really important to make that distinction, because I think when you don't think about something in any great detail, nor why would you as an average citizen of the world, but when you don't think about it, it's really hard to get to that baseline that you're talking about, Del. But
can you have concrete without cement?
No, essentially, okay. No. Now you can have construction materials without concrete for sure. Touch on that really quickly before I get to clinker. You know, as it relates to other construction materials, and particularly as it relates to decarbonisation, I'm a massive fan of exploring absolutely every avenue that we can to help decarbonise with the various building materials that we have. And clearly timber, for instance, is one that always gets brought up as one that we should be focusing on in more detail. And to an extent, I totally agree with that. Where possible and where available, and where it's reliably and sustainably sourced, we should absolutely be using timber. But we've also got to recognize, those numbers that I mentioned earlier on about the amount of concrete that's consumed in any given year just dwarfs any other building material that's available out there. So, again, I love my stats, Dale. So, but I feel it helps bring context. But there was another stat I read recently, which was a great analogy, and it was, if you were to replace only 25% of all concrete consumed in any given year, for a single year, just replace 25% of that, maybe it was only 20%, you would have to cut down a forest 1.5 times the size of India. If you were to replace just 25% of concrete for a single year with timber, that's how much timber you would have to cut down. It's just mind blowing, again, how much concrete is consumed and how nothing else can be really sustainably put in its place. Now, absolutely, we should be using timber where possible, and where it's sustainable to do so, but we have to be realistic about what we're trying to do here. And I know I'm jumping ahead of myself here talking about decarbonisation, but rather than trying to replace concrete, we have to try and decarbonize concrete, which is where we have to try and decarbonize cement, which is where we have to try and decarbonize clinker. And the reason I say that, and going all the way back to the baseline again, is what I should have mentioned earlier on is, let's take a big cube of concrete. Concrete tends to come in meter cubes, okay? Yeah. Take a meter cube of that stuff. Only about 10% of that will be cement, okay? So the rest will be sand, stones, water, etc. But only 10% is the powder cement. However, that 10% converts into about 90% or 94% of the carbon footprint of concrete. So even though it's only 10% of the mass, it converts to 90 to 95% of the carbon footprint of concrete. So essentially, when you try to decarbonize concrete, the end product, you have to try and decarbonize cement. Now, if you go down to the next level, when we talk about clinker, which is a constituent part of cement, on average in Europe, now it sort of changes from country to country, and the UK is, I count the UK as part of Europe in this respect, but like on average, about 75% of the mass of a bag of cement will be clinker. So 75% of the mass is clinker. However, wow. 94% of that is, or about 90 to 95% of that is the carbon footprint of cement is clinker. So you go from clinker being only 75% of cement and cement only being 10% of concrete, but you've got this thing, clinker, which is responsible for about 90% of all carbon footprint associated with concrete. Wow. So you bring it all the way back to the baseline, as you say, Dale, and you can talk about efficient use of materials and these various other elements, but you essentially bring yourself back to this thing called clinker. And this thing called clinker is, again, it's an amazing product, and I'll talk about that in a second, why it is amazing. But unfortunately, it's got a massive CO2 footprint associated with that. So when we talk about decarbonization of concrete, decarbonization of cement, we're actually talking about how we deal with this thing called clinker. Okay.
Where does clinker come from? Is it a natural resource? Is it mined? What is clinker?
Yeah. So clinker is basically the simplest way to put it is, the way you make clinker is you dig up limestone, which is effectively the most abundant rock on the surface of the earth.
Yeah.
And you heat that to an exceptionally high temperature. And you heat that to an exceptionally high temperature with a couple of other little things like clays. But generally speaking, you're talking about limestone. And so when you heat that up to, I think it's 1450 degrees Celsius, that obviously consumes a huge amount of heat energy. And that obviously, the types of materials that we use to heat it with, like pet coke or coal, it gives out a huge amount of CO2 when you do that. So there's a big CO2 footprint associated with the heating of the kiln to cook essentially the limestone. However, the CO2 emitted from that is only about 33% of the problem, which is surprising to a lot of people, because you think, if I could just electrify the cement process, I'll get rid of the CO2 footprint. That'll only solve 33% of the problem. 66% of the problem, about 2/3 of the problem, comes from the fact that when you heat that limestone, it basically degrades into CO2 and clinker, essentially. And let me explain that in a bit more detail. And I told you I'd get detailed if you wanted me to get detailed.
We're loving this. Keep going. Keep going.
But limestone, its chemical composition, and bear with me, is CaCO3. So
Okay.
it's calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Now you recognize certain letters in there because what comes out the other side is CaO, which is essentially quicklime and combined with a few things as clinker, and CO2. So you cannot, so basically when that degrades, CO2 is just a natural emission associated with the production of clinker. So there's literally no way that you can produce clinker without producing quite a huge amount of CO2. In fact, when you make clinker today, for every ton of clinker produced, you'll produce between 800 and 850 kilograms of CO2. So it's a huge amount. Like it's nearly a 1-for-1 ratio. And that's because you've got these things called process emissions, which are basically not the energy emissions are obvious what energy emissions. The process emissions are emissions associated with the CO2 simply coming out of the limestone and leaving you with clinker on the other side. So there's if we look and I'll pause after a second, but like if we think about how we look to decarbonize clinker or certainly the cement production process, there's two things you can do. If you want to, let's concentrate on cement because clinker goes into cement. If you want to decarbonize cement, you can do one of two things. You can either capture all the CO2 that's coming out of this process. So as I say, there's a huge amount of CO2 coming out. Capture as much of it as possible. I'm sure you guys will know all about carbon capture and storage and utilization, and you may have even talked about it in your previous podcasts. We can talk about that in a second if you want. The other way to decarbonize cement is simply to use less clinker altogether. So find ways of making cement where you don't need to go through this process of making clinker in the first instance. That's where we as Ecocem sort of place our business. It's the non-clinker usage element. And so, as I said earlier on, you've got a situation today where about 75% in Europe, about 75% of cement is clinker, and of that, the majority of the CO2 of the cement is associated with that clinker. So therefore, try your darndest to try to reduce that clinker as much as you possibly can within your cement mix, because if you can reduce your clinker amount, you're going to therefore effectively, or not effectively, linearly almost reduce your CO2 output associated with that cement as well. So those are the two ways that you can decarbonize, and we concentrate on the latter at Ecocem.
So that's awesome, and you explain it so clearly, and I think most people, will be able to follow this very, very easily. Now, you've got me fascinated in this clinker product because surely, if you don't use as much clinker, does it jeopardize the concrete? Or you're going to tell me, no, there's innovative ways, there's other means in which to strengthen the concrete by substituting perhaps the clinker. Is that sort of where you guys are at with this, or
absolutely so clinker, so much clinker is consumed within the cement production process because it is the most abundant, efficient way of making cement.
Right.
So if you consider the fact that the cement production process has been the same for over 200 years. I mean, it's pretty basic innovations in that meantime, but essentially at its core, it's been digging up limestone, heating it to a very high temperature, and having this great product at the end, which is very malleable. The CO2 thing has never been a massive issue, right? It's up until relatively recently, and Ecocem was actually founded in the early 2000s off the back of the Kyoto Agreement in the mid 90s. And it was doing really well for the early 2000s, and then bang, the financial crisis hit, and everyone forgot about CO2 again, up until relatively recently. And when I say relatively, sort of 3-4 years ago, maybe a touch longer, but sort of in that time period. But there was never any need to look beyond clinker because it was such an amazing product, right? However, there's a reason why only 75% of European cement is clinker, why wasn't it 100%? Why wasn't it 95%? Why, in fact, in America up until quite recently, it was 95% clinker. Cement was 95% clinker.
Oh, wow.
But the reason why Europe has a lower percentage, all the way down to sort of 75%, is because there are other products out there that have very strong cementitious qualities associated with them. So cementitious is probably a word that
That's
very
a
few people
massive word. I've never heard you use such a big word.
Say that 5 times over. But I'm sort of bamboozling people, I think, today with the words clinker and cementitious. But hopefully every day's a learning day, right? But so cementitious products are essentially hydraulic binders, which again isn't a very useful phrase, but like it's essentially a cement, another something that has cementitious or gluable or binder properties, right? And so there's a bunch of products out there that exist with these qualities, and they're really good, and they're even have superior qualities over clinker in many instances. So the durability associated with some of these other products, which are called supplementary cementitious materials, SCMs, are exceptionally good products. The challenge is that they are simply not as abundantly available as clinker.
Okay.
And remember, as I said, clinker is made from digging up limestone, one of, if not the most abundant rock on planet Earth on the surface. These other products are not, in many instances, or if they are, they just haven't been as researched as heavily over the last decades as clinker, because there's been no need to, because clinker is such a good, cheap product, right? But there are others do exist, and whether they are byproducts of other industries, such as granulated blast furnace slags that come from the steel industry. Coal has a byproduct called fly ash, both of which have been consumed extensively in the UK for a long period of time. Calcine clays, natural pozzolans, and indeed the Pantheon, which we see standing proudly today in central Rome, was not built with clinker. It was built with a natural pozzolan. A pozzolan is a volcanic rock which has very strong cementitious qualities associated with it. So there are lots of other products that do exist. They simply do not have the same availability or economic cheapness, let's say, as clinker production. And that's been as a result, it's never been a consideration. Now, because of the carbon situation and because of the amount of CO2 associated with clinker production, we as an industry are beginning to focus more and more on these alternatives to clinker, because they, generally speaking, if not all of the time, have a much less CO2 footprint associated with them than clinker does. And so there's a lot of research being put into it at the moment to try and find out ways to reduce the clinker amount by as much as you possibly can in cement. And you're seeing some countries going faster than others. The UK, actually, because it's historically had an abundance of sort of these byproducts from the steel industry or the coal industry, is actually quite advanced in clinker substitution, as we call it. The USA, albeit has a strong coal industry and steel industry, it's generally been located in a very small geographic region in the Midwest. And as a result, in many other parts of the USA, it's got very high clinker amounts in its cement, because it just simply hasn't had access or hasn't bothered, or whatever phrase you want to use, to really push the clinker element downwards. But that's a long-winded way of answering your simple question, Dale, which is no. There are ways and means, and proven ways and means, to reduce the clinker amount significantly without detrimentally impacting strength, quality, durability, etc.
That's awesome. And I think what I take from that is one of the key, I guess, challenges or hurdles around moving away from clinker has been capitalism. And people want to make money ultimately. And if there's a cheaper way to do it, and there's no incentive to use sort of more climate friendly, carbon friendly materials, then then why do it? But I think that's changing.
Oh,
But
absolutely, absolutely. Like just to jump in there, apologies. And this is where CO2 is really changing the game at the moment. In Europe, in particular, the carbon tax system that's been set up is essentially going to, by 2035, so 10 years or 13 years or 12 years away, it feels like a long time, but in the world of slow moving industrial products is only around the corner. There will be a situation where the cost of producing a ton of clinker could triple so as a result of the CO2 costs associated with clinker production being put in place by the European system at the moment. So at the moment, across Europe, emitters of CO2 in theory have to pay a CO2 tax on the CO2 that they produce. However, they've been largely those taxes have been largely hid from them for a long period. But up between 2025 and 2035, gradually those barriers to CO2 taxation will start getting taken away bit by bit by bit, such that by 2035 they'll be fully exposed. And as a result, the cost of producing anything associated with carbon emissions will increase in cost significantly. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier on about clinker, and you raised a great point, Dale, earlier on about it. It is a wonder product in many ways, except for the CO2. It costs about 35 to 45 euros, pounds, dollars. It's all kind of the same these days, but it costs in and around that region to produce a ton of clinker. 35 to 45
that's nothing.
pounds.
That's
It's
like nothing.
nothing.
Yeah.
It's a round of beers these days. You know what I mean? And that's it. And a ton is a lot of stuff, right? So you've got this exceptional product historically that is really cheap, really abundant. I mean, you can call it capitalism, you can call it whatever you want, but like it just made sense. Why wouldn't you do this if you're not considering the CO2 element? Now, clearly we are considering the CO2 element these days. And when you consider that the CO tax associated with, CO2 taxes could be, or certainly they're close to 100 euros a ton of CO2 at the moment today. They expect it to rise significantly. You add on 100 euros of tax to this stuff, you go from 35 to 45 euros a ton to produce this stuff to well over 100. And that's a massive impact. So these guys, like the cement industry is very, very focused on finding solutions, not to reduce clinker for clinker reduction's sake, but because there's massive economic benefits in doing so.
Do you think some of the tier 1, tier 2 contractors are sufficiently bought into reducing their carbon footprint given the amount of given the amount of concrete usage, or is it almost going to be commercially driven like you say there? And then my follow-up question to that is, what in your view, what's the role of government in construction and working towards net zero? So in the UK we have a target of being net zero by 2050. Do you think government should get more involved in regulating the industry? You've already mentioned the EU taxes on that. What's your kind of view of where the big construction companies are at the moment, and then what should the government or governments be doing around the world?
So actually it's really interesting. I think again, working it through to the baseline, as Dale said at the beginning, I'm an engineer at heart, so I'm the same as you guys. I like to do this, but we actually work with some of the biggest construction companies in the world, like Vinci Construction or Vinci or whatever is pronounced at various other parts of the world. But like Vinci Construction in France, we work extensively with them, and some of our low carbon, exceptionally low carbon products have been used by them in the likes of the Grand Paris Express, which is Europe's, I think, biggest infrastructure project, the Athletes Village for the Olympics. We're using stuff with them. I think we poured something with them in Heathrow Airport recently.
Oh wow!
So we're doing quite a lot of stuff with these contractors, and I think there's a real desire amongst the contractor industry to drive low carbon construction. And I think if you think that through, I think a lot of it comes from if you think about the very, very top of the chain, the finance world, where I historically sort of inhabited. they're demanding low carbon construction now. Governments are demanding, to an extent, and we'll get onto that in a second, low carbon construction. And so as a result, contractors feel the need and the pressure to bring forth low carbon construction. You then move down to the next level in that particular chain, and that's the concrete producers. So concrete producers are different to cement producers. Concrete producers consume cement that comes from the cement producers to produce the concrete to make the buildings that the contractors want. So concrete producers are different cement producers. And so the concrete producers are under a large amount of pressure to decarbonize, or certainly bring through low carbon cement and concrete as well. The challenge then occurs that when those concrete producers go to the cement industry, and the solutions simply aren't fully available. Like, people are working on these now, but they're simply not fully available now, because whether it was a historic lack of incentivization or lack of a need to change, or whatever the case was, if there's only high carbon cement available, what are you going to do? Like, you can't do much. Like, the building has to get built, so the concrete guy has to take the cement that's available. If that's high carbon or low carbon, let's hope it's low carbon, but if it's not, so be it. And if you can call it whatever you want, but if you want to get your building built, you have to sort of roll with the punches to a certain extent. So, but I think absolutely there's a desire across the chain, but particularly at the very top of the level, at the finance government level, I think, certainly in terms of, I don't think it's purely platitudes either. I think that they genuinely want this to happen, and as a result, contractors are doing the same. But change, we will get the change that we need to get eventually. I think where governments sit is their ability to accelerate that change. And so I mentioned earlier on in Europe, and the UK has followed the European model of carbon taxes. Now, there's been a few recent slight amendments at a political level around that whole sort of mechanism. But generally speaking, carbon taxes across the UK and Europe are a very, very strong mechanism by which we can incentivize or force the pace of change from a decarbonisation point of view. And you're beginning to see that sort of filter through in the amount of innovation that's coming through. However, governments can always do more. And ultimately, governments are, generally speaking, across the developed world, they're the ones who consume 50 to 60% of all cement produced. Infrastructure projects run by governments are massive, and you certainly don't build tunnels or bridges out of wood, generally speaking. It tends to be, or certainly a huge amount of that tends to be cement or concrete. So their consumption is absolutely massive. So they can absolutely drive the necessity to bring through low carbon cement and really drive through the acceleration towards low carbon, and simply not take no for an answer. So, for instance, in Ireland, where I'm from, I was really proud to sort of see an announcement, I think about 6 months now, where the government not only specified, now this is still going through regulation and policy, so we'll see where it sort of lands, but they not only specified low carbon cements had to be used, but they specifically said low clinker cements. And that's a really, really important thing, because if you specify low clinker, again, as I say, you're going right to the source. And I think governments getting smarter around that and really getting specific in their requirements for low carbon is only going to benefit things. Another example is, for instance, in the Netherlands, where if the government is undertaking a public procurement project there, if you are within 10% of the project cost, but you can prove that you are low carbon through various metrics, you will win that over your competitors. So it's really setting the bar and accelerating the degree to which low carbon can be incentivized.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you're saying there about being a real driver for change. I kind of thought back about the plastic bag tax in the UK. It almost reduced the consumption by about 95% overnight. And really? Yeah, you've mentioned so far a lot of the countries and governments who are doing these kind of carbon taxes and incentivizing it are probably more developed countries, more European countries, where So how are the kind of Chinas, Indias of the world? How far behind do you think they are behind the the UK, Europe, America? Are they on the same trajectory? Do they have the same incentives?
It's
In your
really
view?
interesting, right? So here's the thing. In many developed nations, they actually have a lower clinker content in their cement than we do here. And that sounds completely counterintuitive, given everything I said about the low cost production of clinker. But let me explain that. To produce to build a clinker plant, it'll cost you between 250 and 350 million euros, pounds, dollars, whatever, maybe even more these days with inflation. But it costs a huge amount of money, and these are big old pieces of machinery. So to find the correct piece of land in the right location, close to your raw material supply, close to the end consumption supply, to get the planning permission, and whilst I appreciate in some countries planning permission might be easier than others, nevertheless, these things do pollute the air in many respects. A lot of countries, including China and India, are really wising up to air pollution. It can take a long time to not only source your land, to get your planning permissions, to eventually build this, and it costs you a huge amount of money. When you consider the difficulty in bringing these things through, let's park that for 1 second. It's very difficult. Now you flip over to a country like China or India, which is building like crazy, right? These guys, and remember when I said there's a new New York City going up across the world every single month. Like, these guys are building like nobody's business, and not just in India and China, but many other countries. So it's not a CO2 problem. Their issue is capacity.
Yeah.
How can I keep getting more and more of this stuff out when it costs so much money and it takes so long to set up one of these plants? I still need to build bridges. I still need to build hospitals, schools, houses, etc., etc., etc. And I can't do it fast enough. So you end up in this sort of situation where necessity is the mother of all invention. So you use the materials that you have available to you to produce the cements that allow you to move forward as fast as you possibly can. Don't get me wrong, they still consume a large amount of clinker, but the amount of clinker that they have in their cement can be nearly 50% less, or certainly 35%, 40% less than the average European or American cement. So whereas the clinker content of cement in the USA is anywhere between 85 and 90%, and Europe is sort of 75%-ish, down around China a few years ago was down around 50%, because they were just finding other stuff. They had a big steel production industry, which had a lot of byproduct coming off it. They had lots of coal power plants, the same with India. They can put that into their product, right? So again, it comes down to the availability of that material associated with, well, first of all, is the geography set up for you? Just because limestone is a very abundant product, or rock, doesn't mean it's everywhere perfectly around the world. But you still have to build everywhere in the world. So there's a thing of, A, can you build your clinker facilities fast enough? B, is the raw material available to you? And if it's not, and you can't build fast enough, find whatever else you can to get your stuff built. And back to your point, Dale, these countries are building really, really, really robust pieces of infrastructure with clinker contents that are a lot less than necessarily what they need to be, you could argue. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Martin, but it's a weird one, and it's very location specific. And in fact, I go back to the point of raw material availability. In a lot of West Africa, there's no limestone, right? There's no limestone. So what are you going to do? They've imported a lot of clinker historically to build the structure they need to build. But in the likes of Ghana, they've now moved to a product called calcine clay, which is essentially, it's clay that you heat up to a very large extent that performs like a cement. It's just, because it doesn't have the CO2 in its core being, it doesn't decarbonize in that respect in the same way as clinker decarbonizes or throws the CO2 into the atmosphere. So you can make calcine clays instead of clinker in Western Africa, and that's not necessarily a capacity issue with building their plants fast enough. It's they don't have the raw material. So it depends on different parts around the world. You will see these really interesting opportunities where the necessity is the mother of all invention type scenarios keep popping up. It's really interesting.
I love this. Oh, and I don't know if you know this about me, but I grew up in South Africa, and one of the businesses my family had was a building supplies store.
Got it.
And I knew what concrete was made up of. I mean, I've obviously asked you this for the audience today, but I knew you took cement, you mixed it with whether it's sand and crusher run, as we called it, and whether it's 1 to 4 and the different parts of water, and you made concrete. But I find it fascinating that you can decompose all the, like I say, the constituent parts to make us truly understand where carbon is. And bringing this back up to your point on sort of almost substituting clinker, if the alternative, as you say, is carbon capture and carbon storage, because there just isn't enough other raw material to replace clinker, what are we doing as an industry or as around the globe? What are the different types of carbon storage and capture when it comes to making cement, I guess, with less clinker or no clinker even? Or with clinker that emits carbon during the process? Is there stuff we're doing?
Yeah. Okay, so let me just put you straight on one thing. Low carbon cements and low clinker cements are being used widely across Europe and around the world. Okay, not widely enough. And let's take Europe as an example because it's closest to home, and it is a technological. The really interesting thing about Europe actually is that it is home to essentially the cement industry. Cement industry is one of the few industries, along with the car industry, where Europe is a genuine leader. The likes of Holcim, Heidelberg, Butzi, Vika, like these are the biggest cement companies in the world outside of China. But they are genuine world leaders. And so let's be clear. Low clinker cements, low carbon cements do exist. So, for instance, whilst the clinker content of the average cement in Europe will be about 75%, in the Netherlands, for instance, it's below 50%, because there is a large steel industry in the Netherlands which can consume the slags that come off that. So and indeed the construction project that we're undertaking with Vinci, the Grand Prix Express, we have Europe's lowest ever carbon CO2 footprint cement being used in that, and it's got a carbon footprint of, I think, about 75 kilograms per ton of cement, when a ton of traditional or conventional cement would be more like 600. So we're nearly 10 times less CO2, right? The issue is, and you did point this out to be fair, is that historically it's been very difficult to scale low carbon cements because there simply isn't the abundance of materials available to do so in comparison with clinker and in comparison with the amount of construction that we need to undertake. However, this is, I guess, where a huge amount of innovation is taken. So, for instance, at Ecocem, as an example, we're not resting on our laurels by saying, okay, we've got a really cool low carbon cement, but whoop-de-doo, you can only produce so much of that because there's only so much of that material available. That's not really going to. It's nice to do in a particular project, but you're not decarbonizing the industry, and we've got a mission to decarbonize the industry. So we are bringing forth new methodologies, new low carbon alternatives, and other people are doing the same to an extent where we can reduce the clinker amount of cement by up to 70%, from the 75% it is today down to about 20% on average clinker footprint, or clinker content within cement, on a truly scalable global level. So I just want to sort of point out that historically, you're right. It's very difficult to scale low carbon cements because the amount of unabundantly available materials was holding that back. However, that is changing with a huge amount of research and development being undertaken by Ecocem and many others. But I guess parking that for one moment, and by saying that today we feel at Ecocem the most scalable low carbon cements that you can possibly make will have still about 15 to 20% clinker in the cements on a scalable basis, you're still left with CO2.
Yeah.
And so we still need to look at carbon capture as a platform that can help ultimately get us to net zero. I think what we're very passionate about saying in Ecocem and other low carbon cement producers is that we should focus on the low hanging fruit that we have available today, i.e. try to reduce the clinker amount within cement by as much as we possibly can, using all of the materials that we can, and focus as much R&D development as we can on bringing that down. Because if you can get rid of the CO2 at the source, you don't need to worry about capturing it and utilizing it in the future. I think, unfortunately, a lot of focus, rightly or wrongly, has been to solely focus on CCUS as the answer or the panacea, almost to the detriment of looking at anything else. And so, I am more behind carbon capture and storage than nearly anybody else, because I focus on the cement industry. I look at the cement industry and I know how important carbon capture and storage is. But the thing is, if we purely focus on that, on a technology which really won't be abundantly, or what really won't be widely used till the mid-2030s at least, and then has various operational issues associated with that, if we're waiting till then, we've lost the game. We have to decarbonize by a huge amount by 2030. So let's not just focus or put all our eggs into that particular basket. Let's focus on pulling down the low-hanging fruit elsewhere as well. And I feel, at government level, and sort of back to your point earlier on, Martin, I think the government, for instance, is focused on low-carbon cements and is focused on the consumption of low-carbon cement. And the reason being, by the way, and I failed to point this out at the very beginning, the CO2 associated with the production of cement represents about 7 to 9% of all CO2 produced globally. I mean, that's more than aviation, which we all know about, shipping, which we all know about, and long-haul trucking, which we all know about, combined. Combine those three, and cement is still more. So governments are really, really focused on this. But sometimes we feel like the focus is too myopically in one particular direction and not spread across a number of different levers which we need to pull. Like, for instance, take the power sector. We didn't decarbonize the power sector by just putting carbon capture plants on coal plants. We didn't say, the only way to produce power is to burn coal and we'll put carbon capture on top of that. No, we pull that wind, we pull that solar, we pull that hydro, nuclear, etc., 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 and we're continuing to innovate in those places. And so we say the same about pretty much every industry, and given we're in the cement industry, that's what we focus on at Ecocem as well.
So it's interesting. If we look at perhaps life cycle analysis of concrete, right, from all the way from production all the way to deconstruction, are there potential recycle reuse technologies that we can use that help with carbon as well?
Absolutely, and we in fact I was chatting to I introduced a company to our R&D department about a month ago with a company that's doing some really interesting stuff in this space. So again, particularly in Europe, there's been some really great innovations happening with the recycling of concrete fines, for instance, and these may or may not have cementitious qualities associated with them, but you can certainly use them instead of landfilling them. You can certainly, and you should be using them. Now, we at Ecocem, and again, apologies to sort of keep banging on about us, but we, again, it's like timber. Like, as far as we're concerned, we absolutely should be doing this. But for us, you can't recycle concrete fines in sub-Saharan Africa when there's nothing to recycle. These guys are still building new roads, infrastructure, buildings. So we have to find ways of allowing the developing economies to grow, but on a low carbon basis. And yes, absolutely recycle where we can recycle, use timber where we can use timber. But ultimately, our focus is on finding how we scale low clinker cements, and we feel passionately like that's where the focus needs to be, because that's the most, if you can crack that nut, it's the nuclear fission sort of situation where, like, power issues are no longer a problem. Did I get that right? Was that power fission or fusion is the big one that we're trying to crack? I can never remember. But yeah, that we feel like getting clinker as close as possible to zero is where we need to focus efforts. And we're not the only ones doing that. There's a lot of very smart people, including the majors, trying to do that. And we will see results in the next few years. But I think
was going to ask you how you
faster.
say the next few years. How close are we? I mean, is there an alternate to limestone?
Yeah. Like
you're not going to give away your secrets, are you?
No, I can give away a few. Like I think we focus. I mean, listen, when we talk about using the most abundantly available materials to help produce less clinker, all we do is not all we do. It's very complicated, but it sounds quite simple. Instead of burning the limestone to produce clinker, we grind the limestone before putting it through the process. So I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole here, but given your penchant for going into detail, Dale, I'll go down a little bit. But basically, I mentioned earlier that on average in Europe, cement contains about 75% clinker. It contains about 20% ish other low carbon cements. And it contains about 5-ish% limestone, just filler. It's just filler material. It's just like ground chalk, and you just throw it in there. And it's called filler because all you're doing is just filling out the space. Like you're filling out more space with this stuff, so you can produce more cement basically for free. And that limestone filler it's inert. It's abundantly available because it's also limestone, and it's ridiculously cheap, and it doesn't give out any CO2. It's historically been used for very, very minimal purposes. What we do at Ecocem is we maximize to a huge degree the amount of filler that can be used in cements, thereby reducing the amount of clinker required by as much as we possibly can, and also reducing the amount of low carbon materials within that cement that need to be used as much as possible. And the reason why we minimize those as much as possible is because if we minimize those in any ton of cement, it allows us to spread the availability of those supplies over much, much greater volumes of cement and concrete. So we're trying to minimize it in any given ton of cement so it can benefit a much larger amount of cement and concrete. But we do so by maximizing the use of this limestone filler within cement. All sounds very easy, obvious. There's massive technological challenges associated with that, but they're ones that we are overcoming and others are overcoming as well. And it's a really, I don't know how to explain this, but it is a very exciting space in the material science world. The increased use of filler materials, inert filler materials, basically using any inert filler material that is in your presence, just grind it up as fine as you possibly can, throw it in your cement, and through various methodologies and manipulations, you can get a very, very robust, very strong, very durable cement and concrete to keep your clinker content as low as you possibly can. The reason it hasn't been done before, alongside the sort of technical challenges associated with that, is because there's never been the incentive, right? We mentioned earlier on, like why would you go through the trouble of it's a complicated procedure, it's difficult to do. The whole construction industry has been set up to do high clinker cements. Everything's working tickety-boo. It's why change this? It's and we have a phrase internally at Ecocem. It's CO2 changes everything. It really does, and it brings through innovation. And there's a lot of people focusing on this type of stuff now. I'd bet that we're towards, or if not at the vanguard of that, and that's an exciting place to be. But there are people chasing this down because if you can maximize the amount of filler material, it's cheap, it's abundant, it has no CO2, you're onto a winner.
Given the amount of work that's going on clearly in your industry and companies such as yourself, do you feel generally some of the major European American governments are committed enough to hitting net zero targets? So, we've seen recently in the UK, they've rolled back on some of the short-term commitments still with, still aiming towards 2050. But do you think this is this really affecting you? Like, is it hampering, helping within the construction industry? Because some of it is going to be commercially driven, like you're saying there. there's a need, and there's obviously clearly some brilliant work happening. Like, what's the impact on yourselves?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think another really key benefit of maximizing the amount of filler in your cement is that it's also really cheap to do. We're not getting a new foo-foo material from the moon, you know, that sort of can be used in a few tons of concrete. We're using abundantly available materials, and we're doing it very cheaply. And you're able to do it in the existing cement plants and facilities that are available around the world today. So I think, you know, leaving governments to one side, I think there is a genuine desire in the capitalist world, Dale, that wants to decarbonize, and there's a real desire to do so. And I think if you can produce a low carbon alternative that is in and around the same price as the high carbon alternative, you will see people go for that. Now, I think when I said earlier on where governments can help is I genuinely believe they can accelerate it. And I think they need to accelerate. But I think people are going to inevitably move in this direction anyway. But like to give an example of our own company, we're out the door in terms of people getting in touch with us about this product, about when they can use it, about how they can help us get it through the standardization process as quickly as possible so that they can use it, because they want that competitive advantage. I mean, if you're a concrete producer and you can go to a contractor, whoever that may be, and say, see that guy over there, I've got the same product as he has, but mine's low carbon. That's a very strong competitive place to be. And whether governments are necessarily genuinely backing that or rowing back on that is kind of moot from our perspective. You know, that's kind of micro. I think at a macro basis, it's quite interesting. I think you're seeing different things happening in different economies, right? And I actually, for my sins, spent a lot of time in the likes of Brussels, Westminster, the Irish equivalent. I can't speak French, so not in France, but we got a team who are doing this. But like we spend a lot of time trying to get this message out to governments and supra governments that alternatives are available and should be heeded and should be brought forward. And it's very interesting to see the different approaches that you're seeing in the likes of the USA versus Europe versus the UK. I think most are directionally traveling in the same direction, some possibly more slowly than others. But what I find more interesting is how they're doing it. You know, the USA is throwing literally $1 trillion at the problem. You know, I mean, it's that the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, you know, they are throwing money at this. Europe has an aging population. It's not the base currency of the world. It's got its own sort of longer term problems. It can't just throw trillions of dollars at this or euros at this thing. Instead, it uses regulation and it uses stuff like carbon taxes to get through the problem. And the UK is trying to play somewhere in between the two of them. And, you know, I think it needs to get a bit more sophisticated in how it thinks about it. But, and I think genuinely, you know, there's obviously elections coming up, and so there's going to be a lot of politics played around this particular element. But I think genuinely and generally, directionally, everyone's moving in the same direction. And, you know, China has its own way of doing things, and India has its own way of doing things. But there's a real need and desire to make this work. I think it needs to be faster, and I think the focus absolutely has to be on 2030 as opposed to beyond that. But I do think people are and trying in many instances to do the best they can.
Yeah, I think you're right, Eoin. It's always dangerous when an Irishman talks about the IRA, but we won't go down that route.
I mean, yeah, they could have named that better, couldn't they? I mean, Joe Biden, he calls himself Irish, and he named it that. I think that was pretty special. I don't know what he was playing at,
but on your point about price point, you're right though. If you think about it, right, you'll only get to the right price point when you achieve economies of scale. And with anything new, it's always going to be more expensive in the beginning because you're throwing money at research. It's, you know, new tech. You don't have necessarily the factories, the machinery, the technology built to scale yet. And I think you're right. This is where governments can help if they potentially force industry to go that way. We'll get to the correct price point where, you know, using low carbon or no carbon concrete with the right technology is the same price as using concrete with.
Absolutely, and it's they don't necessarily even need to force. As I said earlier on, in many nations, governments consume 50 to 60% of the product. So even if they just want to prove that a technology works or help it get to the scale that allows it to get to its economies of scale and brings down the overall cost, they can play a huge part in that. There's obviously incentives, there's tax breaks, there's straight up grants that are available. I think it's being too myopically focused in one particular direction, all associated with that, as opposed to other types of low carbon cement technologies. But that's beginning to change as well, and I think you're going to see the fruits of or the rewards coming off the back of that. But I think a good starting point is governments putting their money where their mouth is and actually consuming this stuff themselves.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. If they're one of the key, I guess, the demanders, if I will, for lack of a better way of putting it, of the product, then they are part of the problem. And this one might be a little bit left field, Owen, but with all innovation going into concrete, and the past sort of month or few weeks back, and it's probably still in the news, RAAC, right? It's been in the news for the wrong reasons. Technology.
I should have done my research. I knew he'd hit me with something.
Are we in danger potentially of creating innovation in concrete and then decades later realizing that potentially the innovation we had has jeopardized the standard quality, etc.? Or do you think we've got the right standards, protocols, processes in place to prevent that from happening?
Yeah, listen, I think there's a number of lessons to be learned from the RAC situation. First of all, actually, technically, it wasn't even a concrete. It was essentially a mortar, But I think that here's the thing about that as well. It actually lasted for its technical lifespan. It lasted for the 30 years and beyond that it was meant to do so. The problem was that for whatever reason, local authorities or governments specified it in buildings that were clearly going to last longer than that. And the reason for all of that was because they had to build really quickly after the war. I mean, this was a necessity situation in the UK at the time. And frankly, it's I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but it's frankly a testament that it lasted so far beyond its technical lifespan, right? I mean, that's an amazing thing, right? So I think, but to get more serious on it, that was a failing of planning, of government due process, making sure that we're keeping our citizens and children safe. I think nowadays the standards process are unbelievably rigorous. It can take 15 years for a new cement to get through into the market. Now, and from our point of view, that's far too long because the rate of technological change allows you to test and manipulate and check the durability and the strength of these things far faster than that particular time frame. Nevertheless, we are seeing a robust standardization process being brought up. And I mentioned earlier on that Europe is, I guess, the epicenter of cement science in many respects. And where Europe standards lead, many others follow. So whether that's in Africa, many parts of Asia. So in the USA, it's slightly different. They've got their own standardization process, also exceptionally robust, and South America tends to follow that. So are nothing in comparison to 1950s UK, where things were rushed through. And don't get me wrong, the most important thing about cement and concrete is not its CO2 content. It's the fact that it needs to stay up, it needs to stay safe, it needs to be robust, it needs to be durable. But I think the really good news associated with all of this is the low carbon clinker alternatives. I mentioned that they've been used for donkey's years, even when CO2 wasn't an issue. They were used largely for performance bases. So they actually help. I said earlier on, clinker has many advantages. Abundancy of supply, cost association, ease of use, etc. the low carbon alternatives to clinker have been used historically for their durability advantages. So, in many seaside structures or infrastructure projects, you will have low carbon alternatives to clinker specified, not because they're low carbon, but because they've got better durability traits associated with them. So, again, a fairly long-winded answer to your pretty simple question, Dale, but I think in a nutshell, the standards processes are far more robust, and they are exceptionally robust. Trust me, we spend a lot of time going through these processes. We're very confident by them. But I guess the alternatives to clinker-based cement can do and will show benefits from a durability point of view as well.
Now, you bring up a good point there, durability, and I know it ranges depending on how the concrete's put together, what's the makeup of it, how it's being installed, maintained, all that type of thing. But it was quite interesting. I was chatting to Adam Robinson, who's been on the podcast before, and he was project director of the Boston Barrier. And he was saying if we're designing, for example, the Boston Barrier or anything else to last for 100 years, what happens after that? Because, these are massive construction projects, right? Do we have an answer? I mean, we won't be around. Well, maybe we will. Who knows? There might be a pill that someone invents. But if we're only designing them for a lifespan of, let's say, a century, what happens beyond that? Are we actually constructing buildings and things that are actually going to end up crumbling one day, and we're going to have a massive problem?
I don't know, Dale. Like, I think look at I go back to my point about the Pantheon. Okay,
yeah.
Pantheon's been around for was it 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, or something around then. That was built with a pozzolanic material, what we would call a low carbon cement alternative today, but basically it was the cement that they used back in those days. They didn't have clinker. Clinker has been around for about 250 odd years. So as it relates to the buildings that we are building today, my guess is that the more we understand about technology, the higher our standardization process goes. I think the longer lifespan that is demanded by whether standardization industries or governments or what have you, I think you'll actually see modern buildings lasting longer than buildings that have been built in the last 100 years, right?
Yeah.
Because we know that these are problems, because we are seeing things crumble. We are seeing this RAAC thing, that is going to roll on for years, and you will see lots of positive benefits coming out of the back of that. So listen, I don't know the exact cement or concrete that's been used in this Boston Barrier. I don't know the specification profiles that are going into it. That's for them to determine. But there are ways and means that you can get exceptionally durable products into the market. And if you'll indulge me for one last go,
of course.
The way here's I'll give you a bit of insight into key innovation. I mentioned at the very top of the podcast that one of the great benefits of concrete is that it flows like water for a couple of hours, takes any shape for a couple of hours, and hardens, right? So we like our concrete to flow like water. Here's the really counterintuitive thing. Too much water can be bad for your concrete, because concrete or with too much water ends up having little pores in it, full of little water globules, which eventually evaporate. And when they evaporate, they lead to little cracks, which ultimately disintegrates the concrete. So you want to get to a situation where you have low water cements and concretes, right? And if you bring down your water content, that's a really, really good thing to do for your long-term durability and long-term strength of your product. However, what's that going to leave you with? It's sort of a gloopy, viscous mess of a concrete that can't flow like you want it to flow. And that's where you're seeing a lot of really interesting innovation happening in the market today, bringing down the water content of concretes to it, but they still through
malleable.
various methodologies and means can still flow like water and have those longer term durability profiles associated with that. And that's sort of innovation at its heart. And people tend to think that cement is cement is cement, concrete is concrete is concrete. It's been done the exact same way for hundreds and thousands of years. what could be possibly different about it? It's everywhere. But like, there's the amount of innovation going on in the space is pretty insane.
Yeah, you must have seen those competitions where people build concrete canoes.
Ah, yeah. Exactly.
Have you seen that, Martin? You look like you haven't seen. Yeah, they build concrete canoes and they try and make them seaworthy and buoyant. And it sounds crazy, but yeah, go and have a YouTube of it. It's pretty cool. Owen, I'm fascinated. Honestly, genuinely, like I know you've been on other podcasts. I've listened to you on how passionate you are about this topic, but I love the fact that you're passionate about it because I've never spoken. No, genuinely, I've never spoken to someone that's as excited about concrete as you are. I mean, you know, you only top it by your love for rugby, which we probably should get into.
And my love for you.
And your love for me. It's mutual. We got to go into a bit of prediction. We're recording this ahead of the quarterfinals. Of course, Ireland are playing New Zealand. Ireland are number 1 in the world. Do you have a prediction for us?
Oh my God. I mean, this is, I literally barely slept a wink last night because I'm already excited about this game. So by the time the game rolls around, I'm not even sure if I'll be awake to watch it, let alone predict what the score is going to be. But it is, I think this is probably the biggest game in Irish rugby history. And I think it's basically going to come down to, they've proven over the last couple of years that they can handle the pressure. But I mean, this is just at a whole other level. And having beaten the All Blacks down in New Zealand, like win the Test series in New Zealand last year, I think was it an All Black scorned is an All Black that you want to be wary about, you know.
Yeah.
So I think it'll come down to, I think the key is that I think Ireland as a unit are incredible, and they're a beautiful thing to watch. It's a well-oiled machine. I think I actually get a bit annoyed when people just call them slightly, robotic, because I think there's a lot more skill than that deserves. But I think we can sort of hands up say that the individuals coming out of the All Black team or the New Zealand team are, they've always had the best rugby players in the world, right? I mean, they just do. They can break a game. So honestly, like, I don't know what the odds are, but it's going to be ridiculously tight. Of course, I'm going to say Ireland are going to do it. I've now jinxed my entire country. So if they don't get through, I am not promoting this whatsoever for you, I'm afraid.
Well, the beauty about it, Owen, is this podcast will only get released after the results.
So we can put this bit out. I like it. Or at least I'll give you my New Zealand prediction now instead, so you can just copy that one in instead.
No, we'll keep it in. We'll keep it in. If I add my view on France, South Africa, I do think we'll edge them, just because I don't think France have come up against a very robust physical side in a long time. But if South Africa don't make it through, my support is behind Ireland. So there you go. Look, it would be remiss of us also not to mention, give a shout out to our rugby club, the Rosen Park Nomads as well, Old Mads as we're known. One last question from me, Owen. What do you think the lads are going to say, listening back to you and I talk about concrete?
I don't think they'll make it this far. I think I fully expect lots of abuse to come my way, and it's all well deserved. And as you say, to get passionate about concrete and cement takes a very special person, and I will take all slings and arrows that come my way as a result. So bring it on.
Awesome. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I know there's so much more we could go down. As you say, there's many rabbit holes. I feel like we definitely need to get you back when we have some more technology advancements, particularly around clinker and the reduction thereof. It sounds like, there's exciting innovation happening in and around concrete, and it's very, very appropriate to the vast professionals that listen to this podcast around the globe. So thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Before we let you go, are there any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
No, just you said next time when we have innovations we're talking about, I think it's happening. It's out there. I think everyone can sort of play their part. As I say, cement is ubiquitous to the point of anonymity, but I think it's a case of pushing your government leaders to really take notice of this. I think it's one of those products that, let's face it, it's grey, it's pretty boring, not many people think about it, but it is a massive issue and a massive problem. And there's lots of specific issues within the UK which I didn't even touch upon, which we could even leave to the next time. But it's really important that we get this right. It's along with steel, the biggest industrial producer of CO2, and we have got to get both of those industries right. So if I can spark the imagination of anybody out there to sort of look into this further, I think I'll be a happy man, because it deserves more focus than it probably gets. But I'm excited by what the short-term future holds in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've certainly sparked our imaginations and a whole bunch of listeners listening to this. So once again, thank you very much, Eoin Condren. There you have it, folks. That is the episode. That is the end of this episode. But remember, before you go, please do help us pay it forward and share a link to this episode on your favorite social media. Once again, a massive thank you to our guest on this episode, Eoin Condren. And thank you all for listening. Till next time, we say stay safe, be disruptive, and have fun doing it. From me and Martin, it's bye for now.